Well, welcome. Welcome everyone to the second installment of our Across the Aisle conversation with our Watson Senior Fellows, Michael Steele and Tom Perez. I'm Susan Moffett. I'm the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy here at the Watson Institute. So glad to have all of you here. Welcome to all of our friends and colleagues in the overflow room. We would invite you to come down for questions and answers. We want all voices to be part of our conversation today. So I'm just going to give a few brief remarks, and then let's dive into our conversation, and then more importantly, let's get to your questions. So let's start at the end of our table. We are delighted to have Michael Steele join us at the Watson Institute as a senior fellow. In addition to being a senior fellow, Michael is a writer and a journalist and an analyst for MSNBC. He previously served as the chair of the Republican National Committee and served as lieutenant governor of the great state of Maryland. He was also a partner in the law firm Dewey Liboff, and also a co-founder of the Republican Leadership Council. Michael, so good to have you with us.
Be here.
Thank you.
Great to see everybody.
And joining me right next to me is Tom Perez, who presently serves as the chair of the Democratic National Committee. He has also previously served as Secretary of Labor, the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the Department of Justice, and the Director of the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Health and Human Services. He also served on the Montgomery County Council in the great state of Maryland also. Thank you, Tom. Throughout this semester, both Michael and Tom have been leading a study group here at the Watson Institute, and we're so grateful for the model that they provide on how one can be deeply committed to public service and deeply committed to the well-being of the United States, and deeply committed to ideas and debate, but do so from different perspectives, different preferences, different points of view. So we're deeply grateful and thankful for providing us for a model of what civil discourse is like. So I'm going to offer a few questions here. We're going to have a bit of conversation, and then we'd like to open up the floor to your questions. And I'd like us to pick up some themes that you raised last time about the looking forward to the election. So let's start with turnout. We had an impressive turnout. Yeah, the highest levels in 50 years for midterm election. You know, on the one hand, we can see that as a manifestation of the upside of partisanship, right? The upside of intense feelings. But I was remembering, Michael, you mentioned last time that parties play a dangerous game when they cut too close to the bone and play to raw emotions. And I was wondering if you could help us make some sense of the turnout that we saw. Is this a signal of renewed political engagement, parties playing to raw emotion, some of both?
Well, it's great to be back. I'm glad everyone survived the election, and that's especially true inside my party. At the moment, we're trying to figure out a number of things, which we'll probably get into. I think, if you recall, I had raised going into the election two questions which I thought were important. And the first, I remember tweeting them out and sharing them here, was what kind of country do you want? And the second was, what kind of leaders do you want to run that country? And I took away from the response across the spectrum, folks beginning to answer that question, those questions in their own way. It was not so much about the policies or even the manic nature of Donald Trump as it was sort of a taking back and assessing exactly the impact that elections can have and do have, as well as what role we as citizens would play in that. And if you recall, I also pressed those who were at that gathering to get off their butts and go vote. and to be a part of the citizen responsibility to exercise the franchise that has been handed down for the last 240 years to each and every one of us, regardless of your party, regardless of your views. That is the one thing that no government that we can ever create can take away from you. And so it was very heartening for me to see people actually go out and respond to that across the board. Yes, a lot of that was passion-driven, an anti-Trump response. A lot of that was also very positively driven by the number of women, especially who were on the ballot, who found support among citizens who in the past had not been that friendly towards female candidates. When you look at how they won this in this cycle versus how they performed in previous cycles. So there was a lot there, which was very, very good for the country. Now the test comes over the next 2 years that your party now has at least one of the chambers. And by the way, I want to just say congratulations to my friend Tom. As I mentioned, he probably has not gotten a whole lot of congratulations from folks around the country who tend to want to claim victory for work they did not do, and in fact probably stood more in your way than helped. But as I remember 2010 very well and how that went for me. But it's a testament to, I think, sort of sticking to some core ideas that resonate with voters, and the voters then translating that at the ballot box. And so congrats on that. And now the hard work begins, because the next 2 years, folks, is not going to be easy. We're doubling down on crazy. And you've already seen it just in the last 2 weeks. Today, the president is attacking a retired admiral who is suffering an illness because the admiral was critical of him at some point. This is the space we're in. So that citizen responsibility has been amped up even more so, I think, going into the next 2 years.
You know, I said when I was here for the last time we spoke that our democracy was on fire, and it was a 5-alarm blaze. All right.
We are healing what is wrong. We are standing for our future, and together we are strong. We are standing for our future. We are healing what is wrong. We are standing for our future, and together we are strong.
We are here today as Sunrise, Rhode Island, to demand stronger leadership on climate change from the Democratic Party. As we speak, nearly 1,000 people are missing in the California fires, and over 77 have perished. As the UN Climate Report tells us, we only have 12 years to radically transform our economy and society to stop the crisis of climate change. But politicians like you have not demonstrated the leadership we need to meet the scale and scope of this crisis. We need you to stand up for our generation. We are asking that the DNC reject all contributions from fossil fuel lobbyists and executives, and we are asking for the Green New Deal to be incorporated into the Democratic Party platform as outlined in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's resolution for a Green New Deal.
Okay, thank you.
We are standing
It's
for our future. We are healing what is wrong. We are standing for our future, and together we are strong. We are standing for our future. We are healing what is wrong. We are standing for our future, and together we are strong.
And this is a manifestation of political voice, right? As we were
It
just
does.
talking
Exactly what
about,
it's
the
about.
importance
Exactly
of
what it's about.
turnout and engagement. And we will take the opportunity to talk about money in politics, I hope, at some point in our
Amen.
conversation today. But let's pivot back to your...
Sure. Well, let me just say I'm glad that they came. I'm glad that they spoke. I wish they had stayed. Because I was about to answer their question,
part
but
of the conversation.
It
It can't be a one-sided conversation.
And I look forward to having that conversation. We've had some good conversation actually in the class that I'm doing this semester. There's been a lot of students in my class very interested in climate, and the Democratic Party is very interested in climate change because climate change is real. And one of the many things this president did that is that defies logic, as we watch what's happening in California, is to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords. And one of the first things I hope our next president, a Democrat, will do is to get back engaged in that. And one of the, I was looking at the first row, and one of the participants had something that said, "Good jobs and a livable future." That was her T-shirt. I couldn't agree more with that. And that's exactly what we have to do. In the area of climate, one of the most important things we need to do is to make sure that we build a table that includes everybody affected, because climate change is real. We don't need to debate that. And we've had many, many reports to that effect. And we need to make sure that as we address this and move toward a clean energy economy, that we include everybody there. Because I've met with my friends from the environmental community, and I've met with my friends from the labor movement. And in fact, what we're doing right now in the Democratic Party is sitting down with people across the spectrum. Because as you move forward in this area, it's so critically important to understand that there are many, many people affected. And if the, okay. See, climate change is real, okay? It's very real here at Brown University, okay? You know, I've spoken to, again, my friends from the environmental community, and I've spoken to folks who are working, you know, in southeastern Ohio, and that person asks the question, if the cost for me of climate change is I have to leave my job that's paying me $25 an hour to take a job that pays $13 an hour, is that fair to me? And so these are the questions that are very real questions as we transition to a clean energy economy that we're neck deep in discussing. And just one more thing, and then I want to get back to your question. The DNC has taken no money from fossil fuel industry, and we have controls in place that have assured that's the case. So just wanted to correct one little factual error that was part of what they were saying. You know, I was thrilled by this outcome for the simple reason that it wasn't simply how many seats we won, but it was how we won those seats. We became a 50-state party again. We competed everywhere. We have a member of Congress from Oklahoma who's a Democrat. That didn't surprise me because we became a 50-state party shortly after I got here. We invested in Oklahoma last year, and we helped win 4 state legislative elections in special elections and beat red Trump country. And that's because we were organizing everywhere, and Michael and I were talking before, we were listening. In Oklahoma, the reason we have a governor-elect of Kansas, a member of Congress from Kansas, a member of Congress from Oklahoma, and new state legislative folks from Oklahoma, and Kansas for that matter, is simple. School children, tens of thousands of them in those 2 states, go to school 4 days a week because they've cut their budgets not to the bone, but through the bone. And the they in that sentence has been Republican leadership, a guy named Sam Brownback in Kansas, and the Republican leadership in Oklahoma. And you know what? That's not a good strategy for any community in this country or anywhere in the world to have less education for your children. And so our message resonated everywhere. And the 2 most important issues that people cared about were healthcare and education. It's a variant on one of Michael's points. Like, what kind of future do you want to leave to your kids? And so our folks who were knocking on doors in Oklahoma were hearing from people, you know, I'm a single parent, and every Friday I got to figure out what to do with my 10-year-old because they're only going to school 4 days a week. That is ridiculous. And so organizing everywhere was critical. And organizing in every community was critical. And I'm very heartened by the fact that millennial turnout increased 50%. It's still not where it needs to be, but it increased 50%, and the lion's share went with Democrats. I was very heartened at the increase in AFAM turnout, especially in some key states. You look at Latino turnout, went up 145%. You look at Nevada, which is now become a reliably Democratic state. And we spent a ton of time there, and the we in this sentence is not just us. I mean, one of the things that I'm most heartened about is success was a team effort. So many folks in the broader ecosystem, including our friends in the environmental community, who were out there organizing, talking to people, And there was a very good message discipline. And it wasn't a message that came from Washington down to every candidate. It was a very organic message from the bottom up that flowed from the fact that we were listening and organizing everywhere. One of my favorite visits I took, and it was the night before the election, I was in Milwaukee, was with a group of folks called, the organization is called BLOC. It's an acronym, B-L-O-C, Black Leaders Organizing for Change. It's in the city of Milwaukee. Mitt Romney won more votes in 2012 in Wisconsin than Donald Trump got in 2016. People told me when I got elected, you got to give up on the industrial Midwest because it's trending Republican. And I looked at the data, and I looked at my own experiences, and I said I could not disagree more with that proposition. And if you simply had the turnout in 2016 in Milwaukee that you had in 2012, you would have had enough. And you had a lot of Obama stay-at-home voters, and you had a lot of Obama Jill Stein voters. That was, the Jill Stein voters was enough to tip the balance. And what this group was doing, along with others in the ecosystem, was talking to people. And there's nothing better than peer-to-peer organizing. These were African Americans from the city of Milwaukee talking to African Americans living in the city of Milwaukee and listening. And in South Dakota and North Dakota, we had Native Americans organizing in the Native American community. We were in rural America so that we could talk about this. And the beauty is healthcare resonates everywhere. A better education for your kids resonates everywhere. And so now the challenge is to sustain this level of political engagement. The question presented in early 2017 was, are all these marches going to translate into voter turnout in 2018? We now know the answer to that. The answer is yes. Now the question presented is, and I didn't even mention the governor's seats, because the governor's seats are as important as what we're doing in Washington. And the last time we won this many governor seats on the Democratic side in one election was sometime in the 1980s or 1990s. It was a long time ago. The last time the Republicans won this many in a single election was 1994. And so when you flip 7 state governorships from Republican to Democrat, that's a 12-year election cycle, because these governors are overseeing a redistricting cycle, and that's a big deal. And when you flip 7 state legislative chambers, 8 if you add in Washington State Senate from last year, that's also a big deal, because these are the folks that are going to be involved in redistricting. And the Republican Party, and Michael was a big architect of this, was very engaged in local elections. And we fell short in those. And this cycle, just to give you a sense, we lost over 900 seats net starting in 2010. And in this cycle alone, we have gained back net about 350 of those seats. So a lot of progress up and down the ballot, a lot of progress with virtually every demographic group, a lot more work to do, and a lot of partnership is what landed us there.
Yeah.
A chairman should get to crow every once in a while, right?
Well, building on that, Tom, last time you mentioned that this year was going to be the year of the woman, right? And we saw a lot of firsts, right? The first 2 Native American women joining in the House, the first 2 Muslim women joining in the House, the youngest woman joining in the House also. And for the
2 women under 30.
Yeah. And Tennessee, for the first time, is sending a woman to the U.S. Senate.
Yep.
So sometimes along with these firsts, though, comes backlash also, could be. And I'm just curious, what do you think the year of the woman will look like moving forward for policy, leadership, party strategy, and do you see the seeds of backlash?
Well, I think when women succeed, America succeeds. So I'm thrilled. And one of my favorite tweets from last week I saw was a photo of the incoming Democratic House class next to a photo of the incoming Republican House class. And I think there was 1 woman in the Republican photo, and the Democratic class was just a remarkable montage of who we are as a nation. And I think I'm thrilled by that, because I think our leadership in corporate America ought to reflect what we look like. Our leadership in political America, in academia, in nonprofit America, in union America, ought to reflect who we are. And I think you end up with better outcomes. And so I am thrilled, not only by the record number of women, but by the fact that we have our first 2 Native American women, the fact that we have our first Somali American in Congress. And I think that is going to have a remarkably catalytic impact moving forward.
I have a slightly different view on that because my concern is, and the test for me will be how these women fit into what is an established order. I've seen a lot of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed folks come to my hometown where I grew up in Washington, D.C., ready to change the world. And they, in turn, were changed. So the real interesting test will be how they come in and change the system from within, or are they changed by the system? And that, I think, is what I'm waiting to see. I'm all down. I saw that tweet, and I hung my head in shame by virtue of the fact I knew it didn't have to be that way. Because I know the aspiring, inspiring, wonderful young women, diverse women in my own party who have not been given voice. Every time I see my leadership stand in front of a bank of microphones and I see 60-plus-year-old white men, nothing against 60-plus-year-old white men, but I know that there are other people inside the party who could be standing there with them. And the one woman who is in leadership has decided not to be a part of that leadership going forward. You know, that, again, sends the wrong kind of messaging and signals from the Republican side. But more broadly speaking, with the 90-plus women who will be joining the House of Representatives under what I will believe will be the leadership of Nancy Pelosi, will be an interesting and I think challenging opportunity for them to reset the nation's course, number one, to redefine its mission in terms of their own lived experience. These are moms, these are professionals, these are sisters, these are daughters who bring a whole array of experiences to the table that a lot of men who come to Washington seem to leave at the door. And that'll be interesting to see how much of that is put into the national dialogue, starting with an issue like health care, following up on issues like education, and even the issues that these students who were here before talking about the environment. What will be the feminine impact on that in terms of our policies going forward? Or will the male leadership that is seen and unseen, okay, let's be real about that, not just in the halls of Congress, but on K Street, on Wall Street, and other streets around the country that dictate the terms of engagement. And a very good, just a quick sidebar on that. So I'm right now, I'm binging on Netflix. Oh gosh, it just left my head. What's that? House of Cards. Yeah, thank you. I got so excited, I was like, oh. And so I'm watching Claire Underwood navigate that role. And what's interesting for those of us who've been in this game for a long time, a lot of the stories that are told about the outside influences sort of dictating the terms of engagement inside are true. And it's very interesting to see, you know, art reflect real life in some instances. And so that for me is kind of what I'm watching for over the next 2 years as we set up for the argument. The kinds of legislation, the passage of that legislation, and more importantly, the impact it has on the Senate, where Mitch McConnell is standing in the doorway basically saying no. He's already started that narrative. It's going to be fun, interesting, and fascinating. And if the women win in this first initial round, watch out. Because what comes after that is nothing but incredibly, I think, good for the country, but incredibly changing for, an incredible change for the body politic.
I mean, the days of a good old boys club have to be over, not just in Congress, not just in state houses, but in
Yeah.
corporate America. You know, I used to, in a prior chapter of my life, I did a lot of work on the intersection of healthcare and civil rights. And there's a very, very strong body of evidence showing that healthcare providers of color are more likely to serve communities of color. I was on a nonpartisan commission chaired by Secretary Lou Sullivan, who was
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Bush 1's
Yep.
HHS
Secretary of Health,
secretary.
yeah.
And the punchline of the report, and Eric Holder was on our commission. It was a totally nonpartisan commission. The punchline of the report was, if you want to address racial and ethnic disparities in health status in America, one of the most important things you can do is ensure that your health professions reflect the diversity of America. And when you have more women in Washington and more women leading companies, large, small, and in between, I firmly believe that the quality of the decision making and the quality of the outcomes will improve. And that is why I am so excited. And we're not near where we need to be. I mean, I'm excited about what's happened in the House, but you know, every time you watch the United States Senate, that just does not reflect America. The House is closer. 4 out of the 7 governors' races that flipped on the Democratic side were women, so we're making progress. But this needs to be a remarkably concerted effort forward. And you know, organizations like Emily's List have done spectacular work, and they fielded inquiries in this from starting January of 2017. They fielded more inquiries from women wanting to run in that 2-year stretch than in their entire previous history combined. That's what is one of the ancillary byproducts of this moment that we find ourselves in, is people have awakened and they have said, democracy can't be a spectator sport, I'm jumping in. And women have led the charge, and I applaud them.
And let's talk a bit about democracy and the process of democracy. And let's look for a moment at Florida and the strong words from the Senate race, accusations of fraud, accusations of voter suppression. Right, but also Florida passes the ballot measure that strikes down laws that prevent felons from obtaining voting rights. So looking at things on balance, what are some of your main takeaways from this election in terms of the electoral process and its opportunities for participation and expression of voice and legitimacy?
I think the process is flawed. It's antiquated. You know, it's locked into an old way of looking at how people express or could express their franchise. You know, it's why I think, particularly coming on the heels of the recriminations of Georgia and Florida, as well as in some other races around the country, every state at this point needs to take a step back and do a wholesale reevaluation of how they put forth the vote, the opportunity to vote, not just in terms of, you know, the legislative requirements and the regulatory process, but accessibility, availability, creating, you know, if a law is written in a way where the fulfillment of that law creates an impression of voter suppression and so forth, then it has to be addressed. A lot of these allegations are in the political ether, so they get tainted out of the box the minute they are made, and therefore they're not deemed credible, regardless of where they come from, who makes them. And the evidence to sort of prove it becomes very difficult, and we saw that play out in Georgia. There are obvious things that they can do, that they have done, like, okay, I'm going to hold these 53,000 votes over here, and we'll get back to those a little bit later. But sir, you shouldn't hold them since your name is on the ballot. Well, no, the law allows me to do that. All right, so there are things that can be done, and should be done in order to address some of these ongoing concerns. And here's the reason why. If we don't start in the next 2 years to do that, what do you think 2020 is going to look like? It is going to be an S show beyond anyone's wildest imaginations. This country will be ripped apart, and you will have a president in the White House who will be very much behind the ripping and tearing of that process, as we saw in this election. I'm not saying anything's out of school, folks. If you follow this election, you had the president himself, after the election, immediately declare, oh, there was fraud, oh, there was this, oh, there was that. So if he's doing this in an election where his name wasn't on the ballot, what the hell do you think is going to happen in 2 years? So the pressure now comes on citizens going to their state legislatures, their governors that are coming in starting in January, and calling for independent oversight of the electoral process and the redistricting process, so that when we go into both of those and go through both of those, we come out whole as citizens. Because my fear is what we got a taste of, and this was just 2 states that were 2 state elections. They weren't federal elections that were being contested. They were state elections. When you have the presidency of the United States on the ballot, when you have U.S. Senate seats, which are federal offices, on the ballot, in which Republicans have a majority of those seats that are coming under scrutiny and fire in 2020, then it is better to get ahead of that, I think, than anything else. So that's one of the big lessons that I took away from the current process. We can litigate whether or not this election was stolen or not stolen. I went through this in 1994 with Ellen Sarbanes' governor's race in the state of Maryland, where, you know, there was evidence of fraud. It is hard as hell in the moment to sort of get your heads around that and prove it. What you have to do after the fact is go back and reassess where the damage was done and try to address it that way for future elections, because the current election, as the candidates themselves realize, you're not going to get the change, because elections have clocks on them when they have to end, when a process has to be done, if you're going to have a recount, et cetera. So there's a lot in the moment that sort of makes it more difficult for a candidate to be successful unless there's just blatant and outright obvious fraud or problems. But going forward, I think over the next year, we can lay down some new tracks, and I think the states should, to avoid what will be a cluster, you know what, come 2020.
You know, we should have a debate in the marketplace of ideas about the vision of our country, and then we should have consensus that we want to make it easier, as easy as possible for all eligible people to vote, not harder. I want to play this if I can. I guess I can't. This is a tape from, I think I played this last time, Paul Weyrich, 1980. This is a guy who is a godfather of the modern conservative movement. And his point was, I want to make it harder for people to vote, because I don't want more people to vote. And what he says is that elections are not won and lost by a majority of people. And quite frankly, we do better when less people vote. So let's move to what we've seen in this cycle. In Ohio, the Republicans had control of the State House and the State Senate and the State House of Representatives. What do? They passed a law limiting early voting sites to 1. So I was in Cincinnati, Ohio, the Sunday before the election, and everyone's applauding the fact that there's a long line at the early voting site. I wasn't applauding that. They should have had 5 early voting sites there, because Cuyahoga County, Hamilton County, which is Cincinnati, is a big county. They used to have multiple sites. Then Republicans had single control of state government. They made it harder for people to vote. In Georgia, we had teams of people who were simply out there at 8 o'clock at night in the dark, when people were still waiting in line at early voting sites, pleading with them not to go home, because they had made it so hard for people to vote. In Mississippi, if you want to vote absentee, you got to get an absentee application mailed to you then you fill it out, then you got to go get it notarized, you send it in, then you get the application, you get the ballot, then you got to go and get that notarized. That's a poll tax, in my judgment. In Texas, where we litigated a case involving their voter ID law, which required people to travel as far as 125 miles to find a place where they could get an ID. This was the record evidence in that voter ID trial. There was something like 44 million votes cast over and by the way, this is not my evidence, this is the state's, this is the stipulated evidence in the record. And I might have it wrong by a couple million. 44 million votes cast over a 10-year period. There were 2 reported incidents of non-citizen voting and 0 reported incidents of in-person voter fraud. That was the record evidence. But this is the epidemic that this president referred to. I could go on, I could give you another 10 examples. Voter suppression is a permanent part of the playbook, and I'll give you only one more. It takes different forms. In Florida, there's something like 14 million adults eligible to vote, and there are over 1 million adults, mostly disproportionately people of color, who've been permanently disenfranchised. Over 1 in 5 African Americans, adults in Florida, are permanently disenfranchised. Of the people in the United States permanently disenfranchised because of a prior felony conviction, over 50% live in one state, the state of Florida. They've controlled the governor's mansion for 24 years. They've controlled the state house for a long period of time. And their form of voter suppression was to make it impossible for people to vote. You can bet your bottom dollar that what we are doing as a result of a ballot initiative that you mentioned, which now gives rights to the majority of previously disenfranchised voters, is we're going to get out there and organize them. I think the margin in Bill Nelson's race was, what, 12,000 votes, something like that? And you got 1 million voters that you can bet your bottom dollar we're going to reach out to. I leave where I started. We should be making it easier for people who are eligible to vote, not harder. And because voter suppression works, it's not, I wish Michael were correct that some folks were going to go take advantage and try, some leaders were going to try and do something about it. But I've seen no leadership on this issue by Republicans who are in power. He's not currently, if he were a governor, he'd have a different opinion. Colin Powell has a different opinion on this. But Brian Kemp and Chris Kobach, who's now about to be the former Secretary of State, thank God, of Kansas, were basically co-chairs in this voter suppression initiative. And that's not who we are as a nation. People died for the right to vote. And we should be making it easier, whether it's a service member serving abroad or whether it's someone right here trying to vote here at home. And this is an endemic problem. And we've started to make some strides, but we've got a heck of a lot more to do.
If I could just dovetail on a couple of things that the chairman said. The first, I agree with you on the access and the ability to the ballot box. Absolutely, I've been an advocate inside my own tent for a while, which much to the consternation of some folks, when I even suggested that we do away with the current primary system that requires 4 states to set the course of the elections for the rest of the country. Why not shake it up and actually have a sort of a lottery system? So the states kind of 2 years out, go into the lottery and they decide, you pull a number or whatever. Yeah. And so guess what? Maine is going first, Virginia's going second, Iowa's going 10th or whatever, So we need to shake up the system, I think, that way. Maybe we get leaders who believe actually voting is so important that we make it a national holiday, and people aren't penalized by their jobs and work to have to go vote and things like that. But here's the other side of the coin that the chairman raises. I can tell you for a fact, and maybe this is one way we start to get around some of this, that when a significant number of voters out there hear the term voter suppression, they don't believe you. In fact, what they believe is that what you're saying is a form of voter suppression. As crazy as that is. And so it's one of those things, which is why I said the state piece is the important piece here. These laws, these rules will only change. Tom can't change them. I can't change them. When Tom was at Justice, he could not change them. When I, as national chairman, could not change them. The state legislatures and the governors have to begin to change these particular rules. We do not have a federal election law that requires you to vote or vote in a precinct or vote in a location. That's all driven by your state legislatures. And so it's going to require citizens being mad enough, to use that term, and care enough about voting to actually force the change in the way the system is done. One state's voter suppression is another state's normal course of voting. They think this is a way to protect against voter fraud. So every state you're going to find is going to be very different. Democrats are going to have a problem in states like Georgia and Alabama and elsewhere. Republicans are going to have a problem in states like Maryland and New Hampshire and California because of the way the legislatures typically interpret the access to the ballot box. So to your point, we have a long discussion ahead of us on this. The short-term point for me is knowing what's coming in the next 2 years. We really should start now and figure this out. Because I'm just telling you, I know the man in the Oval Office. I know how he thinks. And I know what the next 2 years are going to look like, and I can damn assure you what 2020 is going to look like. If he decides he wants to be on the ballot, all bets are off. And I think it's important that we start, this is the early warning, danger, Will Robinson, danger moment where we look at just the microcosm of these two states and have to decide whether or not we want to make the kinds of changes that are going to be necessary to protect the integrity of the ballot box, not just in 2020 but beyond. But we got to start having that conversation. And those newly elected officials in those 300 state legislative seats that have now turned to Democrats are going to play an important role of that. There are a lot, believe it or not, there are a lot of Republicans who do support what I've described. And so maybe in the right circumstances, in the right mix of bipartisanship or nonpartisan commission type efforts, those changes can be realized.
So one more question from me, and then we'll open up the floor. And I want to pivot back a moment to the expression of student voice that started off our session together to think about money in politics. And I'd be curious to hear what you see as the most damaging expressions of money in politics for the democratic system, and are there short-term ways of addressing them?
Well, I've said with frequency, I think two of the most destructive forces in our current system have been gerrymandering, racial and partisan, and dark money. Those are, I mean, in most state legislatures, and this is not a partisan observation, your biggest fear, if you're a Republican, is a challenge to your right. If you're a Democrat, it's a challenge to your left. And the world of dark money, I mean, it's just, you just get absolutely walloped, and you don't know who they are, and they have these great sounding names, except you can't figure out who the heck sent them in. And that sort of corrupting influence of money, I think, has been corrosive on our democracy. I saw a bumper sticker when I was down in Texas, and it said, I'll believe corporations are citizens too, only when I see Texas execute one. I thought that was an interesting bumper sticker, apropos of nothing. But I mean, and the challenge here is you now have a solid working majority on the Supreme Court. who isn't going to do a darn thing about, frankly, either of them. They had an opportunity to address partisan gerrymandering this past term. I actually had some optimism, turned out to be misplaced optimism, that they were going to do something about that. And similarly, in the area of dark money, I mean, they have been the architect even before Justice Kennedy retired. And so, if anything, it's only gotten worse. So you've got to go to state legislatures, and you see some state legislatures doing a lot of interesting things, incentivizing. You know, like in New York City right now, there's an election going on for a public advocate, and I think if you raise $150, they'll match it 6 to 1. So a $150 contribution becomes a $1,050 contribution. So there's a lot of things that are being done at state levels. There are other things being done, like instant runoff voting, that incentivize people to actually talk to the entire electorate. And a guy named Bruce Poliquin in Maine didn't get the memo on that because he ran for Congress in the 2nd Congressional District of Maine. And it was a multi-person field. His approach has been to, you know, get with his base of about 40-some-odd% and not talk to anyone else. His opponent talked to everybody and ended up being the second choice of a lot of people, and he's going to be going to Congress. So there's a lot of reforms that can be done to address some of these issues, but the fact of the matter is we can't look to the federal government in the foreseeable future to address either the gerrymandering issues or the dark money issues, because we just don't have a federal court system that's going to support it.
The gerrymandering part, I differ with the chairman on this one. I think that, just to this extent, I think the Supreme Court will take up this issue. They'll pretty much be forced to, despite the fact that they consider it more of a political question. I think the way the states are kind of moving in this space right now is going to bring all of this to a loggerhead, and it's going to wind up before the court. I'm not convinced it will be as dire as some suggest. We can have our Kavanaugh-Roberts discussion at another time, but I think that the opportunity still remains, as you noted, Tom, with the states going out and actually sort of defining this space with the kind of clarity that I know our governor Hogan has tried to do. When he first offered Mike Miller and the boys, hey, I'll do a commission. They were like, no, because they didn't think they'd get reelected. Now he's got reelected. You know, a commission is a good idea because they don't want the governor drawing the lines. But I think the more we put this in the hands of citizens, it does a couple of things. It strengthens the principle of we the people, which I'm a firm believer in, foundationally, principally. So it strengthens that, and I think secondly, it takes some of the politics off the table a little bit. It's always going to be there, but it does kind of remove a little bit of that. On the money side, as I stated, I think the last time we were together, my view on money is it's property. I can do with it whatever I want, and if I want to give you $1 million, I give you $1 million. All right, to support you and help you run, fine. But the way our system was set up, and I speak from my own experience having had the companion case to Citizens United, which the Supreme Court unfortunately did not take up, I wish they had, because my case that the RNC had argued was to put this back where it belonged originally, where McCain-Feingold removed it, and that was inside the parties. Tom, I'm sure you would love to have a donor write you a $10 million check tomorrow. At one time they could. Now they're not incentivized to do that. They're incentivized to give it to these third-party organizations, these super PACs, which are acting and function as surrogate parties. They're limited in what they can do. They cannot go out and organize on the ground the way Tom can, the way I could. But what they can do is spend that money on TV. So your point about sort of running ads against you as a candidate for the city council or for governor, he's part of a super PAC that sort of drops $5 million into your race. And you're like, where the hell did that come from? This is a $2 million race at tops, and now I've got a $5 million ad buy against me. The The problem with that, and the problem with the system the way it currently is, and this can be legislatively corrected, maybe something that those new members will look at, is a law that says you have to have full disclosure. That's the piece that's missing on Citizens United. There's no requirement to disclose. These entities act in complete darkness and silence, hence dark money. But the minute you put a line on it and says, all right, you're going to write that check, you're going to write that $5 million check to go against her, you have to disclose within 24 hours, by all means available, who you are, what your company does, how much you put into the campaign. That disclosure process, which exists at certain levels at the state level, some states do have that kind of requirement, should be federalized, period. All right, because I do not see, I'd love to know if any of you do, I do not see the case so far that would reverse Citizens United. So the only fix to Citizens United is right now a legislative one in which the Congress requires that there's full disclosure under the federal election laws of any donation made to any candidate at the federal level. Now, the states would have to do something differently.
The irony of your point is that when Mitch McConnell was minority leader, McConnell, in a Democratic majority, he said, "Okay, I think disclosure is as much as we should do, and I could support that."
Oh,
and then when he got control of the courts, I don't support that at all anymore. So
Exactly.
consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, I guess.
That's Washington. So.
Well, now let's take some of your questions. We are a full house tonight, which is wonderful, but it invites us all to be mindful of our airtime, including me. So we would ask that you ask one brief, concise, direct question, and then share the microphone with your colleagues. We would also like to invite our colleagues from the overflow room to come down if you have a question as well. I believe the mic is right there. Go ahead.
Forgive me of my ignorance regarding the super PACs, but I guess I have one question sort of regarding the way that money influences politics, and that would be, how are these super PACs required to interact or engage with the DNC or the RNC? Like, if they have the resources to run ads against a candidate or for a candidate, are they able to do so off of their own discretion, or do they need to gain
Coordination?
Permission?
Different states have different rules pertaining to the level of coordination. In federal races, there are a lot of walls that are erected, legal walls. So I didn't know what the House Majority PAC was doing. I didn't know what the Senate Majority PAC was doing. I didn't know what Priorities, which is the principal Democratic super PAC, was doing, and I wasn't allowed to know. Now, after elections are over, you can compare notes. That's called, lifting the veil. You're allowed to do that, but once you're in cycle, you're not. In different states, for instance, Virginia last year, they have rules that permit widespread coordination. That's both Republican and Democratic sides, so we can coordinate with the broader ecosystem, and so you have a better sense of what's going on. And other states have serious limitations. So you really, it's a Campaign Finance Lawyers Full Employment Act is the short answer to your question.
We have a question back here.
Good afternoon. So I believe the name of this forum is Across the Aisle, which I understand should be a bipartisan approach to what we're having conversations today. In my own view, I think that this has been a kind of a one-sided conversation. Mr. Perez obviously has a lot of good things to talk about. I don't think I've sensed from Mr. Steele the same element of defense of his party. So my question, Mr. Steele, in all due respect,
Sure.
I understand your background. You're an analyst on MSNBC.
Right.
Why is my one question.
Why am I an analyst on MSNBC?
Yes, and then I guess the question
Okay.
is, are you a loyal Republican, and what do you like about the Republican Party?
Okay, so, okay. All right, so first, why am I an analyst at MSNBC? Is because they hired me. So let me ask you this. If you had an opportunity to go to your opponent's home base court, their national communications forum, and plant your flag every day, wouldn't you go and say, hey, let me show you what Republicans think and feel about a lot of issues. Now, before Donald Trump, I got to do a lot of that. You go back and look at Al Sharpton and I really getting into some very heated conversation on policies and things that were going on in the Obama administration. Again, not about Barack Obama, not about him personally, but about health care and about cap and trade and all. Have we had those discussions in this administration? No, we haven't. So the policy issue for me is a big deal. So in that space, I get to do that. I get to talk about it. I get to analyze it. I get to go through my own experience as a former lieutenant governor who's managed a state as a political operative, if you will, as a county chairman, state chairman, and of course as national chairman to give a political insight. So that's why I'm there. They kind of think I'm nice and cool too, so I guess that helps. The second question, am I a loyal Republican? What the hell is that? You have to tell me what that is, because if you're asking me, am I loyal to Donald Trump?
No, that's not what I
Then what is a loyal? What does it mean to be a loyal Republican?
You support Republican policies
And what would they be?
with respect to
Voter suppression.
national defense, immigration, all the macro issues.
I think.
Are you neutral?
No, I'm not neutral. You clearly don't watch me or follow me too much because I'm anything but neutral. So first off, let's deal with this idea of loyal Republican. There's no such thing. I'm a Republican because I choose to be. All right, I've been a Republican for 43 years of my life. All right, because I chose to be. And unless you've been a young black, conservative Republican from Washington D.C. as I was back in the day, that's a different walk than most Republicans have. I chose that walk. I chose it because this party had a value proposition with the American people from its very founding that stood for the rights and liberties of individuals and the freedoms that attend under our Constitution. That, for me, is paramount, why I'm Republican. We can get into the debate on the policy and how that plays out, but I thought, certainly looking at my own lineage and my own family and my own history, this being the home of blacks to begin with, okay, the Republican Party is where we politically rooted ourselves. It's not where we are today, understood. So that, for me, is part of the history of how I got to where I am. Loyalty is something that is earned, is not given because I'm a member of your team. And if I'm using that as the basis, the party has not been very loyal to the values that I hold dear, that I ascribe to, that drew me into the party. When we back away from our views on debt and deficits, when we all of a sudden become the party of big government republicanism, that's not consistent for me. So that's not going to be loyal to that. When you turn a blind eye on issues like immigration and start locking kids up and talking about building a wall, if you know our history as a party, we were always a party that fought for assimilation. We believed in welcoming people to this country. That's been our history. So I'm consistent in that. I'm not loyal to what we're espousing today. So many of us feel that the party is trying desperately to move into a direction it should not move. And so I choose to stay and fight in that battle to bring it back towards those tried and true values and ideas that we once thought we believed in. That now, because Donald Trump has come along and has offered us bright shining objects that we go after every day, we watch stand-up gentlemen like many senators who once were valiant in the fight now succumb to just the idea of playing golf with the president. I'd like to think the standard is a little bit higher than that. So my loyalty lies in the idea of republicanism. That's why I call myself a Lincoln Republican. And that's the fight for me. And so I'm sorry I didn't stand up here today and espouse all things Trump, because that for me is not republicanism. Now, when Tom and I come back, and hopefully sometime next year there'll be some big policy issues that we can actually sit down, and you want to see a knockdown, drag out on policy between Democrats and Republicans, I'm there. I'm ready for that. But that's not been the course of our conversation over the last 2 years, folks. And please don't get it twisted and think that it has been, because it hasn't. And so for those, I had someone question my loyalty and my republicanism the other day, and let's just say that conversation didn't go as well as this one. And I'm quite frankly sick of it. I'm just sick of it, because I would never ask you, are you loyal to your party? I don't give a damn. You espouse what you espouse, you believe what you believe. Last time I checked, that's what this country was about. But that tells me where we are. Where you get up in a forum and you question someone's loyalty to a brand, to a party, not to the country. So that's all I have to say on that.
I've known Michael Steele for about a long time. And Michael Steele is a Lincoln Republican. There has been a civil war for the soul of the Republican Party. The party of Lincoln is dead. The reason why there was a lot of outpouring of grief at the death of John McCain was we not only buried someone who was an American hero, someone who I disagreed with on a lot of policy issues, but that's irrelevant. But we buried the party of Lincoln. And the party of Lincoln has been replaced by the party of Trump. And that's why, sir, we're incapable of having that debate, because he is not part of the party of Trump, plainly and simply.
So questions. Some students came back from the overflow rooms. Yes.
Hi, I have a follow-up question for Mr. Steele. I'm wondering, do you think that there is a party to go back to that is the Lincoln Republican in response to that? I'm from Georgia, and watching the election between Kemp and Abrams, Kemp would not have been a candidate 10 years ago with Purdue. That was just not the sort of policies that are coming out. And now Kemp, there's a heavy focus on immigration. That was never a Georgia focus. So I'm wondering, do you see a Republican Party that can go back to?
Yeah, you ask a very important question, and it's one that I grapple with. I'm just being honest about that, and I guess there is this sort of realization that sets in at some point where you go, okay, well, this is done. It's like I got to move on to something else. But what is that something else? And that's, that remains to be seen. So meanwhile, here we are. I was not happy when Steve Schmidt left and my friend Nicole Wallace left, and when George Will left, especially a figure like a George Will, who was part of that intellectualism that defined, republicanism around a lot of nuanced and difficult policies and ideas. And, it kind of laid it out there, and we had these great discussions and these great opportunities to sort of battle over those things in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and the like. And now we don't anymore. It's all about personality. We fall into this cult of personality. So you ask, I think, a very important question. Okay, so you're doing this fight and you're planting your flag. When this is over, what will you go back to? What's going to be left? And so I guess the best answer is whatever remnants are left. And I appreciate what you say about the Republican Lincoln, the party of Lincoln is dead. I won't say it's dead. I say it's slightly comatose. And I got the chest beaters out there trying to resuscitate it to some extent, but we'll see. It's a question I'm stumped by, because I just see the trajectory moving in a very different direction from where I'm trying to pull the party, and a lot of us are, and we may lose that battle ultimately, and then maybe be a part of forming something different or being a part of something different. I don't know, but right now the fight is still worth it. When you cite a good example in Georgia where you see candidates who wouldn't have had the time of day 5 years ago, 10 years ago, now today are the ones who are winning the races. It tells you something that maybe not too good long term, but we'll see.
Well, I don't think they've bottomed out yet. No.
Well, there's always more bottom to hit.
Yeah,
I mean, there's
there's
always more bottom, baby. Come on now.
You have seen since how many tweets has the president sent out about the caravan since the election? I think it's 1 or 2. And that's because that was a fear tactic in the run-up to the election.
In fact, the word
And-
caravan, just to his point, has not been mentioned out of the White House since November 7th.
Yeah, and so that's not hard to figure out. However, I can virtually guarantee you what his closing argument will be in 2020, in the run-up to the presidential cycle. Because you know what? If you look at the exit polling, the number one issue for folks who are still self-identifying as Republicans, immigration was at the top of their list. If it wasn't number one, it was number two. And so it worked in some races, and it inured to his detriment in the aggregate, because it's a very unorthodox strategy to anger just about every segment of America to solidify your base. But I don't think they're done with that, because it has worked in a few states, and so that's why I think this is going to remain their MO going into 2020.
So is more questions that came from overflow room?
I'll take one.
Yep.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm actually in high school, so I'm lucky
Excellent.
to be here.
Very good.
Wow, good for you.
But I'm curious. I think it's funny. I often take it for granted that in the United States, for almost a century, we've had the same two ruling political parties, and they've been incredibly effective. But when you look at other countries, it's not that common that you only have a two-party system. We look at Germany, the EU, and Great Britain, where there are many parties. And I'm curious, given both of your careers, why you think we don't have a third party in the United States.
Well, just real quick, our system is not designed to allow for it as it's currently operated. It is one of the more difficult things to do is to get your name on the ballot as an independent, a member of the Green Party. You know, you look at the Libertarian Party, going back into the last cycle, the battle that they went through just to get on the ballot in 50 states. And not successfully. The same with the Green Party. It is very hard. Now, a lot of that is driven by state statute. The fees that you have to pay, the signatures that you have to get that then need to be verified. And so our system is not set up to allow for that. And it really goes back to the way the founding fathers kind of pulled it all together and sort of compromised themselves into the system, which is why there was such a great debate about political parties in the first place. Many of them did not want us to have that, having come out of the British system, for example, didn't want to bring that to the New World, and so wanted it to be more organic and much more open. You know, the Whigs and the Republicans who became Democrats, and the Whigs became Republicans, and and kind of here we are. I think that's pretty much the biggest obstacle, is the system is not allowed to let it happen. But here's a little clue. Here's a little inside baseball secret for you. Where I think it begins to change. Remember what's happened up to now. Most people run for president. Third party, you know, Ross Perot, they're going to run for president. No. Run for city council. Run for mayor. Run for local office, because at the local level, you have the greatest opportunity to get on the ballot, because a lot of mayors in this country are unaffiliated, because the state statute requires that you can't be a Republican or a Democrat. You can't identify in our state, in our municipalities. 90% of them are nonpartisan positions. I was stunned as a county chairman to find out how many Republican mayors we actually had in Prince George's County, right? But they weren't allowed to run as such on the ballot. So running locally is where you start to get voters to vote for an independent thought, an independent way of looking at elections and looking at solutions, by having these candidates sort of grow on the voters. I mean, we are, by our lot, very stubborn. We like voting a certain way. We don't want to admit it publicly, but I bet you if you were honest and you went back and you sat down, you realized you voted more like your parents than you thought you did, right? And they in turn voted much more like their parents than they did. And that's just the nature of the system. The way you begin to crack at that is to put something a little bit different on the table. And that sauce is really kind of made, I think, at the local level.
Yeah, I mean, the proportional representation point that
Yeah.
Michael makes is an explanation of why it's just a different system. You know, if your party gets 14% of the vote in country X, you're likely to get 14% of the seats in Parliament.
Right.
And we don't have a proportional representation model. One thing that's interesting, and you mentioned what year are you in high school?
I'm a high school senior.
Okay, so if you lived where I live, by the way, you would be able to vote in municipal elections, because presumably you're at least 16.
I'm 18. I did vote in this election.
Excellent. So assuming for the moment you were 16, you would have been able to vote as well in municipal elections. And here's an interesting data point about your generation. When Barack Obama was elected president, the most typical millennial voter, 18 to 29, was a registered Democrat back in 08. Today, the most typical millennial voter, and this didn't simply start in 2014, 2015, it started like shortly after the president got elected, is a registered unaffiliated. And if you go to Colorado, for instance, the most typical registered voter writ large, regardless of age, is a registered unaffiliated. So you asked a really good question, and the proportional representation is part of the answer. But another part of the answer is both parties have to address the fact that a lot of people are voting with their feet. We did superdelegate reform this past summer to reduce the influence of superdelegates, because we heard from a lot of folks, most notably young people, that superdelegates felt wrong. And it felt like the hall monitor, one person said. You're going to trust us, but there's a hall monitor there in case you get off the rails. And so we were making a statement designed to grow the party and designed to address brand issues that both parties have. What heartens me about the midterm election is that independents swung heavily toward Democrats, independents of all ages.
And that's really kind of a first, because they typically break for Republicans in these elections. So that was a big deal for the Democrats to get independent voters. And I think a lot of it has to do with the sort of the thinking of that sort of independent thought. And so they kind of moved in that direction.
A question here.
Hi, turning back to Georgia, I was wondering what lessons you think were learned in a lesser publicized race, the Georgia 6th, where Karen Handel and John Ossoff had a very competitive race, one of the most expensive congressional races on record, almost just over a year ago. But Lucy McBeth managed to flip the seats for Democrats sort of under the radar this midterm cycle. So I was wondering, on both sides of the aisle, what lessons were learned in that race?
Sure. For the benefit of everyone, Lucy McBeth is one of the mothers of the movement. She lost her son tragically in gun violence because he was driving in a car and a guy perceived that the radio was on too high, and he lost his life. Another tragic, senseless issue of gun violence. The lesson that I take away from that election is a lesson that we have put in place everywhere, which is that organizing needs to be a 24/7 operation. There was a lot of money invested in the Ossoff race. 100% of our investment in that race went into organizing African American, Latino, and Asian American communities. John is a fluent Mandarin speaker, FYI, and you look at Nevada, which in 2014 the Republicans ran the table, and now Nevada is becoming a reliably blue state. The reasons are similar. When you're organizing 12 months a year, you're building relationships in those communities. People in Georgia 6 hadn't had a Democrat knock on their door. That was Newt Gingrich's district. And the former HHS secretary, he was the first cabinet secretary to resign in scandal. He held that seat up to 2016. And when he won in 2016, he won by something like 20 points. I forgot the exact margin, but Democrats just hadn't shown up there. And by showing up and building those relationships, people start to understand what we're fighting for. And that's the lesson for me, is organizing everywhere and organizing every year and not waiting until that sprint. And so she undeniably benefited from the foundation of organizing and related benefits that was laid in 2017. And again, I could give you a number of other examples of that elsewhere.
It's an interesting race, particularly given the personal narrative of McBath and that storyline. And it said a lot, particularly when you juxtapose it against the Florida races, but specifically the Parkland students' response and how they changed the dynamic in the Democratic primary and lifted Gillum to the nomination, and still played that narrative out even in the general election. It said a lot about, I think, the overall hold that the NRA and other organizations could have going forward when you have such a strong gun advocate as the Congresswoman-elect coming in, having won in Georgia. I think I don't know if it's a warning sign yet. I don't know what it portends or what it means, but it's an interesting political moment. Her reelect will mean a lot. That's what I'll see the reelect because there's a lot that you can mistake in a clouded moment like this election, where a lot of big things happen. It was one of the more sobering moments for me as national chairman. After some big wins, you have these reality checks that sort of come home, and so you want to get clear of the cloud of euphoria and excitement around a lot of these elections, particularly ones that seem improbable or right on the cusp, to see how they do in the reelect, because the reelect will tell you exactly where that district is. Because remember, the reelect will occur in the first cycle after the redistricting, which will go into place in 2000.
It'll be 2020.
But that's what I'm saying. It's go into place in 2020, right?
They don't redistrict till 2021.
Right, but I'm saying this first election cycle after that. That's what I'm saying. This is going to be outside of that. The redistricting is going to be out.
Oh,
so
yeah,
you're still going to be in the
Yeah.
current setup that we are, because you won't see those new lines until 2022. So it'll be interesting to see how she performs in the next election cycle.
And you can bet your bottom dollar that Matt Kemp will try his hardest, or Brian Kemp, sorry. Matt was the Dodger left fielder, who used to play for the Braves. Well, the 2021 redistricting is going to have Georgia 6 on the mind.
A question for Mr. Steele. We began this conversation talking about problems in Georgia and Florida.
Speak into the microphone, please.
Yeah, okay. We began talking about Georgia and Florida and the problem with the counts and you referred politely to the shit show or the.
I called it the S show.
The S show or the.
He did.
It was being appropriate.
Cluster F.
Right.
If Trump.
I just said cluster. I didn't.
Right.
I'll leave it to your
if Trump put his
imagination.
name on the ballot in 220.
Right.
And I'm wondering, does that mean you're secretly hoping that he'll be impeached beforehand? Because how do we avoid that scenario?
Well, look, impeachment is wholly irrelevant at this point. It's too early, number one. Number two, who's going to convict him? Not the Senate. Republicans aren't going to convict this president. So I think, and I've heard Tom talk about this on national air. That's not the tip of the spear for Democrats. It shouldn't be. I'm not going to give the chairman advice here, but I don't think that's going to be as relevant as a lot of people think or some people hope.
I meant it more, what does it mean for Republicans hoping to revive the party of Lincoln?
Oh, the impeachment piece, or just the whole?
The voters, if you know he's going to be on the ballot.
Oh, it's a problem. It's a problem. Well, it's a problem particularly for the Senate because you've got 20 plus seats up in the Senate that are Republicans going to have to defend in states that Hillary Clinton won. All right. This time around, you had Democrats on the bubble in states that Donald Trump won, and in the main, we picked up one seat. So all the seats that the Democrats were supposed to lose, they didn't in this cycle because they were supposed to be down 5, and they weren't. And so that dynamic is going to be problematic going forward. And again, depending on how the president performs and behaves and tweets between now and then, will drive a lot of that. So you're going to see a lot of candidates, I think, as you saw in this cycle, but in spades, basically beg off presidential visits. Remember, the president in his 11-week tour at the end did not go to states, to battleground states. He didn't go to battleground congressional districts. He went to districts that, it was plus 30 Republican. So, it wasn't complicated for him. That's how they pick up almost 40 seats, because if he had played in those districts, as some of us said, you got to go there. It's a cutting edge, but from a political tactical point, you've got to go shore up your base, support there. And the president didn't do that, which was unfortunate, because some of those seats were salvageable. There is no reason why Orange County is now blue. There just is not a reason for that.
Orange is the new blue.
Orange is the new blue. I give you that. But there's no reason it should be. When you look at the map and you understand the districts that comprise that section of California, I mean, that's Reagan country. I mean, solid red. It's now blue. So there's, if you don't engage, and the president has the power to do that in a way that commands a lot more political capital working for you, you leave that on the table, you lose elections, which is what happened.
But the orange is the new blue for a couple reasons, though, and this illustrates the challenge that the Republican Party has. In 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush won 2/3 of the Asian American vote, and now that has flipped. And you look at the Latino vote, and you look at the demographic profile of what Orange County looked like, and you look at the demographic profile today, and you look at the message emanating from this White House, it shouldn't come as a surprise. And Democrats are organizing there, and organizing big time, and fielding candidates that fit the district. And that's the challenge that Republicans have when you have someone at the top who is demonizing immigrants. And Michael correctly pointed out that the Republican Party once had a rich tradition of supporting immigration. Ronald Reagan, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1996 was Ronald Reagan. And so I'm actually not surprised at what happened in Orange County when you look at the demographic transformation, and you look at the messaging coming out of the Republican Party, and you look at the quality of candidates that are being fielded by the Democratic Party there.
So can I just put a little check on everything he just said? So here's the other side of that coin. And I'm surprised no one's really kind of brought it up yet. But so all this is good right now, but here's the rub for my friend, who is the chairman of the National Democratic Party, Democratic National Committee, is that you can't beat someone with no one, number one. And number two, you still have to reconcile what your message is going to be and how you will speak to vast swaths of this country that, with absent any other countervailing reason, will support the current president. Now, the takeaway from this election from my side as a Republican, it was painful to lose a House that was very hard to get, okay? I understand the politics of that. I understand we lost because, in my estimation, we did not lead with our strength, which was a strong economy, tax cuts, et cetera, et cetera. We never made that case. It was frustrating to watch Republicans walk away from the policy argument they could make. Now, reasonable people could disagree with that argument, right? You could say, well, the tax cut didn't benefit everybody. We can have that discussion. And you'd be right to a certain extent, but still we could have that discussion. With absent that discussion, I think we left ourselves vulnerable to a lot of, and this is why the success of the healthcare piece that your team played worked, because we damn sure weren't going to go out and argue about health care again. That wasn't going to happen. No one was going to go near that issue. And you remember that one moment where Trump said, yeah, I think we'll probably, revisit health care in the next cycle. And McConnell's like, no, we're not. No, we're not. No one wanted to go there. But on the strength of the argument on tax cuts and job creation, wage increase, for the first time in almost 40 years, we've had a 3.1 increase in wages. Let's talk about that, right? So that's my frustration, back to your point, sir, with where we are as Republicans right now. And I think for Tom, his challenge is going to be, he still has Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Elizabeth Warren is very clear, is running for president of the United States. Elizabeth Warren commands a great deal of influence and following inside the party, as does Bernie. We had a Bernie Sanders candidate run in a very blue state called Maryland, lose to a center-right Republican incumbent governor. So that's going to be the challenge. Not in places where you're going to have the win, right? It's in places that are a little bit more purple, a little bit more center-right, center-left, not too progressive, not too conservative. That's going to be the sweet spot for Democrats, I think, in the next 2 years, as you get ready for 4,000 candidates running for president of the United States.
Much to respond to there, but I want to hear one more question.
We have just a few minutes left, so one last concise question. Up in front?
Oh,
yeah.
All right.
Hi. I don't know if this is on. Thank you for coming. Congrats on the win, Tom. I guess one thing I'd like to know is, what should we expect moving forward? Is the new House going to be united to start looking at addressing policy issues, or is something like healthcare just going to continue being like a flag that's more anti-Republican, anti-Trump in a way that will lead everyone to 2020? For context, I'm a medical student, so I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
His future employment depends on it.
Exactly. No, I mean, I think we have to walk and chew gum, and let me describe what I mean by that. I think there's a real opportunity to pass an infrastructure bill, which, among other things, infrastructure is not just roads and bridges. It's a remarkably important way to address climate change. There's so much retrofitting that needs to be done in this country. I mean, just talk to folks in Flint. Flint is a tip of the iceberg. And so there's a remarkable opportunity in the infrastructure context. Infrastructure, by the way, for the party of Lincoln, the limited government, infrastructure was one of the things that they funded. Yeah. And so the irony of this, will be that what you will hear from the Tea Party caucus is, we can't afford it, which doesn't pass the laugh test. And I could insert a word before the laugh, but I won't, because I mean, this notion that you have just bankrupted your country's future with this reckless tax cut, and now you're going to cry poverty when you talk about infrastructure, is remarkable.
But Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are going to pay for that.
Well, that's what Mitch McConnell said in a wonderful gift 2 weeks before the election.
I know, right?
And I talked about that every
day.
Another
moment.
A moment of candor, I would argue. And so infrastructure. We have to make sure that we stabilize the healthcare marketplace. There has been a sabotage campaign underway, and now that you have the House of Representatives, you can do something about that. We have to address the issues involving Dreamers. And, in 2013, there was a bipartisan immigration bill that passed the Senate with a solid majority. I know we're in a different world in 2019 than we are in 2013, but it shows that immigration once commanded a bipartisan, actually it always commanded bipartisanship until recently. And so those are three examples. I mean, we have to make sure we address the issue of wages. I mean, Michael talked about wages. The problem is that if your wages go up $1 and your cost of living goes up $2, you're falling behind. And that's been the challenge in this economy for a long time. The cost of gasoline, the cost of healthcare, the cost of prescription drugs. And that's another thing we're going to do, I suspect that Democrats will do with a House majority, which is to address the skyrocketing cost of prescription drugs. If you know anybody who's diabetic, ask them what the cost of insulin has been over the last 2 years. It is serious, and it's fixable, but you need the will to do it. That's the walking part of getting stuff done. The chewing gum part is, we were elected in Washington to make sure there were guardrails. I mean, there was no accountability. There's so much money being wasted, whether it was the HHS secretary on his planes, the HUD secretary with his taste in fine dining, the fine dining tables and things like that, the EPA administrator and the like. And we need these guardrails. Because that's what the founding fathers contemplated. And so we have to have that accountability, and we should. But there's a broader answer, and it's not just what's happening in Washington, it's what's happening across the country. If we're going to address issues involving voter suppression, as Michael correctly points out, we've got to do that at a state level. And when the Washington State Senate flipped in 2017, and so you had a Democratic governor, a Democratic Senate, a Democratic House for the first time in a long time. The following year, immediately, this past year, automatic voter registration, expansions of early voting, making it easier for eligible people to vote. That happened immediately. And I suspect you'll see a lot of reforms in the democracy space coming out of this House, because we do need to make it easier for eligible people to vote. We do need to address campaign finance reform. And I think you'll see this beginning, and it'll be in the context of infrastructure, the beginning of that discussion about a Green New Deal, because we have to do this. And I think there are some things we can get done. It'll remain to be seen whether the president actually wants to try to get anything done. Again, infrastructure was once a pretty bipartisan issue. And the question presented for him is going to be, are you going to be held hostage to your Tea Party? That's the same thing with
that's not his question.
Everything.
That's not his question. Donald Trump is wholly agnostic with respect to the House and the Senate in terms of whatever political importance they play to him. Donald Trump was clearly not interested in holding the House. He was more interested in holding the Senate for very obvious reasons. I used 2 words, Robert Mueller. And so he needed that backstop. So that's why he fought the way he did for the Senate as opposed to the House. But here's the rub on the House, and let us not confuse ourselves or think otherwise. Donald Trump will cut that deal with Nancy Pelosi on infrastructure. You heard it here first. We've already seen the predicate for it on something like DACA. But for the Senate, the members of the Republican establishment sitting around him at the time, literally watching the new minority leader reach across the table, Kevin McCarthy, to sort of, no, that's not what we mean. When the president was going down that rosy path with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer on DACA, now the script has flipped. I think Nancy coming to the table, which is why her leadership, in my estimation, is going to be more important for the Democrats over the next 2 years than anything else, bar none, because she can make that deal. She can make that deal. Now, and on the Nancy Pelosi front, all these folks saying they're going to run against her, who are you? Because I don't see a campaign, and the election's coming up soon. So don't believe that hype. She will not be challenged seriously. She will be the next speaker. Donald Trump will cut that deal with her on something like infrastructure. Why? Because that's the deal he wanted to cut when he first came into office. And his chief of staff talked him out of it. And he did not want to lead with health care. He wanted to lead with infrastructure because he's a guy who builds buildings. And he likes building stuff. And this is like putting his name on every friggin' building he touches. This infrastructure legislation will be that sweet spot. Trust me on that one. So she can cut that deal. It is the one more big thing he wants to do before he leaves office.
The challenge with infrastructure is there is a Republican vision of infrastructure, the Republicans of today, not the Lincoln Republicans.
Right.
There's a 2018 Republican vision of infrastructure, and there's a Democratic vision of infrastructure. They are radically different. But here is the difference. Anyone here from Cincinnati area or northern Kentucky? There's a bridge in Cincinnati called the Brent Spence Bridge. It's the second most dilapidated bridge in America. I have friends in the building trades who don't use that bridge. And candidate Trump stood in front of that bridge and said, we're going to fix this bridge when I become president. The problem with that bridge is that you can't monetize it. Okay? In other words, taxpayers have to foot the bill to repair that bridge. And the Republican vision of infrastructure is they want to fund projects that were already going to get built so that they can subsidize hedge fund activity on Wall Street. The Democratic vision of infrastructure includes repairing the water pipes in Flint, retrofitting other buildings. These are not things you can monetize. These are the things that are the essence of what government should be doing. And so that will be very interesting because you will have the Tea Party wing who is going to raise poverty and holy hell.
Tom.
Let me say one more thing.
It's time for some wine out in the foyer.
And what I love about what you said about the House is Donald Trump would love to have retained the House, but his conduct made that impossible. And he made what was for him a rational judgment at the end. I'm going to work to save the Senate. And everything he did to save the Senate cost him more seats in the House.
The House was more of an annoyance. The House was more of an annoyance to him than anything else.
Well,
you saw the.
You thought it was an annoyance back then.
You saw the. You know, that may be. I still think that that's going to work out a lot differently. I think people are going to be surprised at the deal that gets done on this. And that's just today. And I hope I'm right, too. I really do. But on the last point you just made, Tom, here's the reality. We've already spent $2 trillion we don't have. What are you talking about? We're happy to spend another trillion or plus. So it's not a big deal. We're the new Republican Party. We spend, baby. We spend. Deficit. You know we're about to run $1 trillion deficit? How do you do that? You got to spend the money. So it's all good. It's all good.
Well, on that, please do join us in the foyer to continue the conversation. And thank you to Michael Steele and Tom Perez.